It was in February, when London's lamps burned like blurred coins behind a veil of fog, that Dr. John Watson found himself reminded, once again, how little the gallows ends. The newspapers had already done their coursework upon Edward Ned Carow of Wapping, a dockside bully, a petty thief grown to a knife man, and finally the supposed strangler of a pawnbroker's widow in Ratcliffe Highway. The evidence had been brisk, the trial brisker, and at Newgate the rope had made its brief creaking comment upon the matter. Holmes, who read the press as other men read scripture, had skimmed the report with an absent air and returned to his chemical experiments. Watson, whose profession kept him nearer the heat of human motives, had felt the familiar mingling of pity and relief which follows such public endings, and he had thought no more of Carow until the morning when Mrs. Hudson entered the sitting-room, wide-eyed. "A gentleman from Scotland Yard, sir," said she, and behind her Inspector Lestrade appeared, hat in hand, his sharp face unusually pale. He carried no official parcel. Instead, he held an envelope of stout cream paper, the flap sealed with black wax. The seal had been broken and clumsily resealed. A narrow strip of frayed brown hemp, an inch of common rope, was pinned to the corner by a steel needle. Holmes was upon his feet, his eyes fixed upon the hemp and then upon Lestrade's left cuff, where a faint streak of soot lay like a thumb mark. "You have come from Newgate," said he. "You have been in the condemned corridor, and you have handled the rope itself. Pray sit down, Lestrade. You look as if you have seen a ghost who insists on paperwork." Lestrade attempted a laugh, but it broke. "If it were a ghost, Mr. Holmes, I'd sooner face it than this. It's Carow, mind you, and yet it isn't. I don't know what to make of it." Holmes took the envelope between finger and thumb. He held it to the light, sniffed, and smiled without mirth. "Gum Arabic," he murmured, and clove, a cheap attempt to mask ink. "Sit, Watson, you will wish to note this." Watson drew his chair nearer, pencil ready. London's justice was seldom sentimental. It did not send keepsakes. Yet here lay a portion of the very instrument which had ended a man. Lestrade leaned forward. "It was delivered to my rooms at 7:30. No messenger would give a name, only said it was to be opened at once. And that if I delayed, I'd have another corpse on my conscience. It's addressed to you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned the envelope over. Upon the back, in a cramped hand, were written 3 words, "For after the drop." Holmes slit the flap with his penknife. Inside was a single sheet and a second, smaller envelope. At the top, in letters that sought to be firm and failed, ran the line, "My last confession." Holmes read in silence. Watson watched the familiar signs. Stillness, the narrowing of the eyes, then that quick inward calculation that never deceived him. When Holmes finished, he handed the sheet to Watson. Watson read, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, if there be such a man as sees what others will not. I am Edward Carow, and by the time this reaches you, I shall have swung. I do not beg mercy, but I will not swing for Mary Hargreaves. I did not kill her. I was paid to take the blame, and I took it. There is a man with clean hands and a dirty soul who walks free because I wear the rope. He has a ring with a red stone. He gave me 5 sovereigns and said I should speak a name in court, and I spoke it, and they said it proved I was there. I was there to steal, not to kill. The killer came after, quiet as a parson. Look for the candle that burned without smoke. Tell my sister Annie in Limehouse that I am sorry, and that the man with the red stone will bruise worse if you do not stop him. Signed, E. Carow. The smaller envelope contained a curl of hair, fair, and very fine, and beneath it the smear of a thumbprint in blackened wax. Watson looked up. "But Caro confessed at the committal," said he. He swore," interrupted Holmes, "as many men swear when a rope is offered in exchange for a greater fear. Observe the economy of his tale. He admits theft, he admits presence, he denies murder." Lestrade struck his knee with a fist. "That's just it. If it's false, it's devilish bold. If it's true, then we've hanged the wrong man." Holmes's gaze had drifted to the strip of hemp. He touched it once, and his fingers lingered as though the fibres spoke. "A ring with a red stone," said he softly. "A candle that burned without smoke. A sister named Annie, and gum arabic with clove. Someone wished this ink to travel, and wished it sent to mislead. Come, Watson. We begin at Newgate." Outside, the fog pressed its grey face to the window panes, and somewhere, far off, a church bell tolled the hour with the patience of stone. Within the hour, we were rattling eastward in a hansom, the fog thinning to a damp pall as the sun struggled somewhere beyond it. Holmes sat forward, long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed not upon the streets, but upon that inward map of possibilities which I had come to recognize as the true theatre of his labours. Lestrade opposite clutched the envelope as though it might yet accuse him aloud. "You are certain," said Holmes at last, "that this was delivered after the execution?" "Caro was turned off at 8, Lestrade replied. "The letter reached me at 7:30. The warder swears no paper left the condemned cell after midnight. We searched it." "Swears," Holmes repeated softly. "And the rope?" Lestrade glanced at the pinned hemp. "Cut from the tail end after the drop. Standard practice. The hangman keeps most of it. Souvenirs fetch a price, but that inch—" He shook his head. "It matches the coil in the execution shed." Holmes nodded. "Then either Caro wrote earlier and contrived its delivery, or another penned this in his name. The question is not when it was written, but who profited by its timing." We reached Newgate as the yard was being sluiced. The prison's brick walls sweated moisture. The air carried the metallic tang of iron and damp straw. Holmes requested the governor, who, though civil, betrayed impatience at our intrusion upon a morning already heavy with procedure. "You may see the cell," said he, "but I assure you the man confessed freely and without coercion." Holmes inclined his head. "I ask only for facts." The condemned corridor was narrow and chill. Caro's cell lay open, its pallet stripped. Holmes entered without ceremony. He examined the small table, the water jug, the tin spoon. He knelt to the flagstones and, with a penknife, lifted a crumb of wax from a crack near the wall. "Black," he murmured, "with soot." "There are lamps," said the governor shortly. "Indeed, and yet the soot lies where no lamp would drip. Lestrade, pray recall the smear upon the envelope." Lestrade swallowed. "The same." Holmes rose and examined the window, barred high, admitting a weak wash of light. Beneath it stood a candle stub in a saucer. "You permit candles in the last hours?" Holmes asked. "For prayer," replied the governor. "It is customary." Holmes held the stub to his nose. "Tallow, but unusually refined. Watson, you perceive the absence of smoke upon the saucer's rim?" I bent close. The saucer was clean, save for a thin gutter of wax. He wrote, "Look for the candle that burned without smoke," I whispered. "Just so." Holmes turned to the warder stationed at the door. "Who attended Caro in the night?" The man shifted. "I did, sir, with Mr. Hobbs, the turnkey. We made our rounds each quarter hour." "Did any visitor see the prisoner?" "Only the chaplain at 6, and Inspector Lestrade at 7 yesterday evening." Lestrade started. I asked him whether he had anything further to say. He declined. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did he possess writing materials? A pencil and paper were granted, said the governor. We allow a last statement to be examined. And was such a statement made? A brief one, expressing contrition. It bore no accusations. Holmes extended his hand. May I see it? The governor hesitated, then dispatched a clerk. When the paper was brought, Holmes compared it with the confession delivered to Lestrade. The hands were similar at a glance, yet Holmes's brow arched. Observe, Watson, the downstroke of the F in confession here bites deep and curves left. In the letter to Lestrade it is timid and straight. The R in Caro here stands proud, there it leans, as if cramped. Cramped by what? Lestrade demanded. By imitation, said Holmes, or by constraint. He returned to the candle. With a match he relit the wick. The flame rose clear and steady, casting a pale, unwavering light. Smokeless, he said, a superior tallow, likely treated with stearin. Not common issue for prison stores. The warder coloured. The chaplain, sir, he brought it. Said the Lord's light should not choke the sinner. Holmes extinguished the flame. And the chaplain's name? Reverend Elias Merton. Holmes's eyes flickered. A man with clean hands, perhaps. Lestrade bristled. You suspect the clergy? I suspect nothing, Holmes replied evenly. I observed that a candle was introduced from outside. That wax of the same composition seals a letter delivered before the execution, and that the letter imitates but does not precisely match the prisoner's hand. These are facts. Now as to the red stone. He turned abruptly to the warder. Did Caro receive money? The man hesitated. He had 5 sovereigns upon arrest, claimed they were his. And were they returned? They were entered as evidence. Holmes's mouth thinned. 5 sovereigns, as promised in the letter. Either the writer knew this sum from public record, or he invented it to lend colour. Lestrade, of the pawnbroker's widow, Mary Hargreaves, described the scene. Strangled in her parlour, no sign of forced entry, a candlestick overturned, but no soot upon the mantel, Caro's footprint in the yard. Holmes's head snapped up. No soot? None. Holmes looked once more at the clean saucer. A candle that burned without smoke, he repeated. At the scene as well as here, perhaps. The governor coughed. If you imply misconduct within these walls, I imply only that truth is seldom content with a single chamber, said Holmes. We shall call upon Reverend Merton, and we shall pay a visit to Limehouse, to a sister named Annie. Between them may lie the hand that guided this rope. As we quitted the prison, the fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal a hard, colourless sky. Holmes walked swiftly as one who scents a trail faint but distinct. Lestrade kept pace, his expression troubled. If this proves a hoax, he muttered, I shall look a fool. Holmes did not slow. If it proves true, said he, we shall all look worse. Let us hope, Inspector, that the candle tells us which. From Newgate we turned first, not eastward, but south, for Holmes declared that the man of the cloth must be seen before the sister of the condemned. The wax cools more slowly than grief, he remarked, as our cab bore us across Ludgate Hill. If Reverend Merton introduced that candle, he did so with purpose. I would observe his countenance before rumour reaches him. The rectory of St. Bartholomew's in the Marsh stood in a modest square off Blackfriars Road, a sober brick dwelling with a narrow garden bravely resisting the season. We were shown into a study lined with theological volumes, of their spines as rigid as the doctrines within. Presently the reverend gentleman entered, a tall, spare figure of perhaps 45, with pale eyes and hands singularly white and well kept. "Inspector," said he, inclining his head to Lestrade, I had not expected— Nor I you, sir, Lestrade returned stiffly. This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. A faint flicker crossed Merton's face at the name. It was gone in an instant. Holmes wasted no time. You attended Edward Carow on the morning of his execution. I did. The poor wretch showed contrition. You brought him a candle. For prayer. The prison stock is of abominable quality. I will not have a soul's last vigil choked by smoke. Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. Your solicitude does you credit. Might I inquire where you obtained the candle? Merton's hands folded with ecclesiastical composure. From a parish supplier, a common stearin blend. Common? Holmes's voice was mild. It burns with remarkable steadiness. I prefer it so. Holmes stepped nearer the desk. Upon it lay a small travelling case, half open, revealing sealing wax, black sticks bound with twine. Holmes lifted one with a delicate motion. You seal your correspondence with black wax, Reverend? It is inexpensive. Holmes turned the stick to the light. And scented, faintly with clove. Merton's pale eyes sharpened. Many waxes are so treated. Indeed. Holmes replaced it. Did Carow write in your presence? He penned a brief statement before I arrived. I read it at his request and advised him to accept his fate. Did he compose any other paper? None that I saw. Lestrade shifted. A letter reached me this morning purporting to be from Carow, accusing another. For the first time, genuine surprise or its excellent imitation touched Merton's features. Impossible. The man confessed. Holmes studied him as a naturalist might a rare specimen. Confession and truth are not always twins, Reverend. Did Carow speak of a sister? He mentioned a relation in Limehouse. I urged him to pray for her. Holmes inclined his head. You are most obliging. We took our leave without further revelation. As we descended the rectory steps, Lestrade exhaled sharply. Well, he's smooth as oil. Oil leaves a sheen, said Holmes. Did you observe his cuffs? What of them? Unsmudged. A man who handles black wax acquires a trace upon linen, yet his fingers bore the faintest darkening about the nail beds as though recently scrubbed. You think he sealed the letter? I think he possesses wax identical in scent and hue to that upon the envelope. Whether he employed it is another matter. And the candle? Holmes's gaze turned toward the river, dull and swollen beneath the winter sky. If Carow wrote under its light, he may have written more than the prison received, but the handwriting troubles me. It imitates, yet lacks confidence. Suppose the letter were dictated. To whom? I asked. To one who could reproduce his hand tolerably, yet imperfectly. A clergyman hears many confessions. Lestrade frowned. You imply Merton wrote at Carow's bidding. I imply that the possibility exists. Let us test another. We hailed a cab and directed it eastward to Limehouse. The streets grew narrower, the air thicker with tar and brine. Holmes sat in silence until we reached a mean lodging house overlooking a clutter of masts and chimneys. Annie Carow proved a slight young woman with red-rimmed eyes and hands reddened by labour. At sight of Lestrade she recoiled, but Holmes's gentler manner soothed her. We come, said he, not to wound, but to inquire. Your brother wrote of you. She pressed a hand to her mouth. They told me he died penitent. He spoke of a man with a ring, a red stone. Her eyes widened. The gentleman? Holmes leaned forward. Describe him. He came twice. Once before Ned was taken, once after the trial. Well-dressed, soft voice. He said he wished to help. He gave Ned money, said it was for a passage abroad when all was done. Did you see his ring? Aye, a red stone, deep as blood, set in gold. On which hand? The right, little finger. Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade. And his name? He never gave it, but he came in a carriage with a crest, 2 hounds, and a star. Lestrade made a note. That can be traced. Holmes's voice was quiet. Did your brother seem fearful of him? Annie hesitated. Not fearful, ashamed, as if he'd swallowed something bitter. Did he ever speak of Mary Hargreaves? He said he'd meant only to frighten her, that someone else came while he was in the yard. He heard a step behind the door. Holmes rose. A step, quiet as a parson? She stared. Those were his very words. Outside once more, Holmes's expression had altered. The languor was gone, and in its place burned that keen light I had seen when the threads of a pattern first revealed themselves. 2 hounds and a star, murmured Lestrade. I'll have the carriage registries. Holmes shook his head. Begin with the Hargreaves household. Who among her acquaintances wears a red stone upon the right little finger? And who attends St. Bartholomew's? You return to Merton. I return to the candle, said Holmes. A smokeless flame leaves no trace upon a mantle. If such a candle burned in Mary Hargreaves' parlour, the absence of soot was no accident. He paused at the corner, looking back toward the river's murk. We have a man of means, a ring, a carriage crest, and a clergyman with scented wax. The rope may have ended Caro's breath, but it has not ended our inquiry. Tonight, Lestrade, we shall examine the widow's parlour anew. Night had fallen by the time we reached Ratcliffe Highway, and the lamps along the narrow thoroughfare burned with a wavering persistence, casting elongated shadows upon the damp cobbles. The house of the late Mary Hargreaves stood wedged between a tobacconist and a shuttered cooper's shop, its brick façade unremarkable, its windows darkened by mourning crape still pinned from the funeral. Lestrade had procured the key, and with a muttered word to the constable on duty, we stepped inside. The parlour retained that stagnant stillness peculiar to rooms in which violence has occurred. Though the body had long since been removed and the floor scrubbed, an indefinable chill lingered. Holmes paused just within the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust, his long frame perfectly still. I had learned that such silences were not idleness but calculation. Describe the position, he said quietly. Lestrade cleared his throat. Mrs. Hargreaves lay near the hearth, on her side, a bruise about the throat, no broken furniture save the candlestick there, which had fallen. Holmes crossed to the mantel. And you observed no soot? None. It struck me as odd at the time. Holmes ran a gloved finger along the shelf. It is cleaner than the remainder of the room, he murmured. Watson, compare the upper moulding to the lower. I did so. A faint grey film lay along the lower edge, yet the upper surface bore scarcely any residue. A recent cleaning? I suggested. Or the absence of smoke, Holmes replied. He drew from his pocket the candle stub obtained at Newgate and placed it upon the mantel. Imagine this flame burning here. A steady, clear, no telltale blackening. Lestrade frowned. But the household candles were common tallow. Precisely. And a common candle would have marked this plaster in a single evening. Holmes bent to the hearthrug. You found Caro's footprint in the yard, he continued. Did you find any trace within? Only scuffs, nothing distinct. Holmes moved to the small escritoire by the window. Its drawers had been emptied, their contents catalogued. He examined the keyhole, then the underside of the writing flap. From a narrow groove he teased forth a minute fragment of red grit. Garnet? He said softly. Lestrade started. From the ring? Perhaps from its setting. A red stone, deep as blood. Annie Caro described it thus. Garnet is common enough, yet this fragment is freshly chipped. He wrapped it carefully in paper. Now, consider the sequence. Caro enters to steal. He is known to the yard. He admits presence. A second man arrives, well dressed, wearing a ring with a red stone. A struggle ensues. The widow is strangled. Caro, hearing or seeing enough to implicate himself, flees and later accepts payment to confess, Lestrade added grimly. Holmes inclined his head. 5 sovereigns, exactly the sum found upon him, a sum sufficient to tempt a desperate man with a sister to support. Lestrade paced. But why risk visiting Limehouse? Why show himself at all? Because guilt seeks reassurance, Holmes replied, or because he required silence. He moved toward the door, leading to the narrow passage. Who discovered the body? A neighbour, Mrs. Pike. She came to borrow sugar. And the time? Near 10 at night. Holmes consulted his watch. If Caro entered earlier, intending theft, he might have been within before dusk. The second visitor could have arrived later, under cover of darkness. He knelt near the base of the door and examined the threshold. Here, he said. We bent beside him. In the wood, scarcely visible, was a faint indentation, 2 parallel scratches no longer than a match. A spur? I ventured. No, the edge of a carriage step-plate, perhaps. If the gentleman entered from a waiting carriage and removed something heavy, say, a coffer or document case, the metal might strike thus. Lestrade's eyes widened. Mrs. Hargreaves kept securities, pawnbroker's notes. Were any missing? A small packet, yes, but we attributed that to Caro. Holmes rose slowly. Caro was a thief of opportunity. Securities require knowledge to redeem discreetly. A gentleman with a carriage and crest would possess such knowledge. Lestrade's expression darkened. I'll have the registries at once. Holmes laid a restraining hand upon his sleeve. Patience. Before we stir the waters, let us test another element. He turned once more to the mantel and struck a match. Lighting the prison candle, he held it near the plaster and watched. The flame burned clear, unwavering. Observe, he said. No smoke. Now, Watson, one of the house candles. From a drawer, Lestrade produced a stub, preserved among the effects. Holmes lit it beside the first. At once, a thin plume of black rose and curled against the ceiling. In a room of this size, Holmes continued, an hour's burning would leave its mark, yet the mantel above shows none save the faint film accumulated over weeks. Lestrade drew a sharp breath. Oh, and then the killer brought his own candle. Or someone did, Holmes corrected. A candle of superior quality, such as Reverend Merton favours. The name hung between us. Outside, a cart rattled past, its wheels splashing through the gutter. You think the Reverend himself came here? Lestrade demanded. I think, said Holmes carefully, that we have a man with a red-stoned ring and a carriage crest of 2 hounds and a star, a clergyman who supplies smokeless candles and scented wax, and a condemned thief who spoke of a quiet step. As a parson, these threads intersect. Whether they bind one man or 2 remains to be seen. He extinguished both candles and pocketed the prison stub once more. Tomorrow, Inspector, you will ascertain which families in London bear that crest. Meanwhile, Watson and I shall attend St. Bartholomew's evening service. Lestrade stared. To pray? Holmes's thin smile flickered. To observe. A congregation reveals much when it believes itself unseen. If a gentleman with a red stone kneels beneath Reverend Merton's pulpit, I should very much like to know it. We stepped back into the cold night, the door closing behind us with a hollow echo. The fog had returned in wisps, threading the street like pale fingers. Holmes walked with renewed purpose, his mind clearly advancing beyond the visible facts. As for myself, I could not shake the image of that smokeless flame, burning cleanly, silently, while a woman's life guttered beside it. The following evening found us seated within the dim nave of St. Bartholomew's in the Marsh, the air heavy with incense and the faint dampness that clings to riverside parishes. Holmes had insisted we arrive early. He chose a pew midway down the aisle, neither conspicuous nor obscure, from which he might command a clear view of both pulpit and congregation. Reverend Merton entered with measured step, his white hands folded within his sleeves. The gaslights above cast a pallid glow upon his features, lending him an aspect almost ascetic. Yet Holmes's attention was not upon the clergyman alone. His gaze moved with quiet deliberation among the parishioners as they settled. Tradesmen with bowed heads, matrons adjusting gloves, a scattering of well-dressed gentlemen whose presence in so modest a church might, at another time, have seemed charitable. "There," Holmes murmured at last, scarcely moving his lips. 2 pews ahead and slightly to the right sat a gentleman whose attire spoke of understated wealth. His coat was of fine cut, his boots immaculate despite the damp streets. As he removed his gloves, a ring flashed upon the little finger of his right hand, a stone of deep crimson, catching the light with a muted fire. Watson's pulse quickened. The description matched Annie Carrow's account precisely. The gentleman inclined his head during the prayers, yet his posture lacked the easy humility of habitual devotion. Rather, he appeared alert, as though measuring the room. Holmes's eyes flicked once toward the pulpit, where Reverend Merton read from the epistle in a steady voice. There was no visible acknowledgment between clergyman and parishioner, yet an indefinable tension seemed to stretch between them. When the service concluded, Holmes did not immediately rise. He allowed the pews to empty in a gradual tide. But the gentleman with the red stone lingered briefly, then moved toward the side aisle leading to the vestry door. Holmes stood at once. "Come, Watson." We reached the aisle in time to observe the gentleman pause near a small table where offerings were collected. He deposited a coin, his ring glinting once more, and then proceeded toward the vestry. Holmes intercepted him with the most courteous of bows. "Forgive me, sir. Might I trouble you for a moment?" The gentleman regarded him coolly. His features were regular, his expression composed. "If you are soliciting alms, I have already given." "I solicit only information," Holmes replied smoothly. "Your ring is of uncommon design. Garnet, if I am not mistaken?" A flicker, swift but perceptible, crossed the man's eyes. "You are observant." "It is my profession." "And what profession might that be?" "Consulting detective." The gentleman's composure hardened. "Then I fear I cannot assist you." Holmes's gaze dropped briefly to the man's hand. "A minute chip mars the lower edge of the setting," he observed lightly. "Recent damage, I think." The man withdrew his hand into his glove. "Rings suffer wear." "Indeed, particularly when brought into sudden contact with hard surfaces." A faint flush touched the gentleman's cheek. "Sir, your insinuations are unwarranted." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you will not object to providing your name." A pause, scarcely more than a heartbeat. "Edmund Rotherhithe." "Of?" "Rotherhithe House, Surrey." Holmes's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, 2 hounds and a star?" For the first time, but the gentleman's control faltered. "I see you have made inquiries." "Preliminary ones only." Rotherhithe drew himself up. "If this concerns the unfortunate affair in Ratcliffe Highway, I assure you I knew the woman only as a business acquaintance. I had no cause to visit her dwelling at night." "And yet," Holmes said gently, "you visited Limehouse more than once." The man's jaw tightened. "Charity, mister? Holmes, was it? I have an interest in reforming the lower classes." "Commendable." At that moment the vestry door opened, and Reverend Merton emerged. His gaze moved from Holmes to Rotherhithe with a swift, assessing glance. "Mr. Rotherhithe," said he warmly, "you have not yet met." "We are acquainted," Rotherhithe interrupted coolly. Holmes turned to the clergyman. "We were discussing philanthropy, mister?" Rotherhithe's concern for Edward Carrow's sister does him credit." Merton's pale eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Indeed," Rotherhithe adjusted his gloves. "If you will excuse me, Reverend." He inclined his head to Holmes with constrained civility and departed down the aisle. Holmes watched him go, his expression thoughtful. "You press boldly," I murmured. "Boldness tests the fibre," Holmes replied quietly. He did not deny knowing Carrow. "Nor did he admit it," said Merton, his tone measured. Holmes faced the clergyman. "You are acquainted with Mr. Rotherhithe? He is a benefactor to the parish. And to the prison, perhaps?" Merton's lips thinned. "I counsel many souls." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Including those whose testimony might prove inconvenient." A flush rose along the clergyman's collar. "You tread dangerous ground." "Sir." "Truth is often so." For a moment the vestry seemed oppressively small, the air thick with unspoken accusation. Then Merton's composure returned. "If you possess evidence," he said coldly, "bring it to the proper authorities." "We intend to," Holmes replied. Outside, the night air felt sharper. Holmes walked in silence until we had turned the corner. "Well?" I ventured. "We have established connection," said he. "Rotherhithe bears the crest described. He visited Limehouse. His ring bears a recent chip consistent with contact against wood or stone. He attends the church of the man who supplied the smokeless candle." "And Carrow's letter?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. If Carrow dictated his final confession, it was likely under the spiritual guidance of Reverend Merton. But whether the Reverend suppressed one version and allowed another to circulate remains to be proven. "You believe them in collusion?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that Rotherhithe had motive to silence Mary Hargreaves and means to bribe Carrow. Whether Merton aided him knowingly or through misguided piety is yet unclear." He hailed a passing cab. "Where to?" I asked. "To Surrey," Holmes replied. "If Mr. Edmund Rotherhithe supposes his ring a mere ornament, we shall show him it is a witness. Tonight we learn what securities Mary Hargreaves held, and who stood to gain by her silence." Rotherhithe House lay some miles beyond the river's southern bend, a substantial Georgian structure set back from the road behind iron gates and a sweep of gravel drive. Lamps glowed warmly in the lower windows, decasting long bars of light across the frost-stiffened lawn. Holmes surveyed the facade with narrowed eyes before ringing. A footman admitted us after a brief exchange, and we were shown into a library of considerable refinement. The walls were lined with dark mahogany shelves. A coal fire burned steadily in the grate. Presently Edmund Rotherhithe entered, his expression betraying neither surprise nor pleasure. "You are persistent, Mr. Holmes." "Merely thorough," Holmes replied. Rotherhithe gestured toward chairs. "If you have come regarding Mrs. Hargreaves, I repeat that I had no involvement in her unfortunate demise." Holmes declined the seat. Instead, he moved toward a side table upon which stood a silver candlestick. He lifted it delicately and examined the candle within. "Stearin," he observed. "A superior blend. It burns without smoke." Rotherhithe's gaze sharpened, as do many candles in respectable homes. Respectable, yes, Holmes said lightly. Less common in modest pawnbrokers' parlours. Rotherhithe's jaw tightened. You imply I supplied Mrs. Hargreaves with candles? I imply nothing yet. Holmes turned, his eyes resting upon a small dispatch box on the writing desk. Its lid bore a faint abrasion along one edge. He stepped closer. May I? Rotherhithe hesitated, then nodded curtly. Holmes ran a finger along the box's rim. A recent impact, he murmured. And here? He stooped, retrieving from the carpet a minute fleck of red stone. Watson felt a tightening in his chest. Holmes unfolded the paper packet from his pocket and compared the two fragments. Garnet, he said quietly. The same hue and grain. Rotherhithe rose abruptly. That proves nothing. It proves, Holmes replied calmly, that your ring has shed its stone more than once, and recently. Rotherhithe extended his right hand with controlled defiance. The garnet ring gleamed beneath the lamplight. Along its lower edge, a barely perceptible notch marred the setting. Holmes regarded it thoughtfully. You visited Mary Hargreaves on the evening of her death. I did not. You conducted business with her, as did many. You had financial dealings she might expose. Rotherhithe's composure flickered. You overstep. Holmes's voice hardened. Mrs. Hargreaves held certain securities, notes pertaining to riverfront warehouses in which you possessed a discreet interest. A muscle worked in Rotherhithe's cheek. Speculation. Perhaps. Albeit speculation becomes motive when those securities vanish the night she dies. Rotherhithe turned toward the fire, his back to us. Even if I visited her, that does not make me her killer. No, Holmes agreed, but it places you in the room. Silence thickened. The crackle of coal seemed unnaturally loud. You bribed Edward Carrow, Holmes continued, to confess. 5 sovereigns were found upon him, the exact sum he named in his letter. Rotherhithe spun. Letter? Holmes watched him keenly. You have not heard? Rotherhithe's face paled, then recovered. I know nothing of it. Curious, Holmes said softly. For if Carrow confessed falsely at your behest, he might later regret his bargain. Rotherhithe's hand drifted unconsciously toward his ring. Holmes advanced a step. The letter bore black wax, scented with clove, identical to that used by Reverend Merton. Rotherhithe's eyes flashed. The Reverend is an honourable man? Honourable, perhaps, yet susceptible to persuasion. You accuse us both? I observe, Holmes replied evenly, that you attend his parish faithfully, that he supplied Carrow with a smokeless candle, that a similar candle burned in Mary Hargreaves' parlour without leaving soot upon her mantle, that your ring bears a fresh chip, and garnet fragments lie both in her home and yours. Rotherhithe's voice lowered. Circumstantial. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, which is why I require one further element. What is that? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Your carriage. Rotherhithe stiffened. My carriage? Yes. The step plate bears a distinctive double ridge. In Mary Hargreaves's threshold we found parallel scratches consistent with such metalwork. Rotherhithe's breath quickened almost imperceptibly. Holmes continued, relentless yet calm. If those ridges match precisely, your presence at her door becomes fact rather than conjecture. For a moment I believed Rotherhithe might attempt denial. Instead, he drew himself upright with an air of cold resolve. You have no warrant? Not yet, Holmes replied. Rotherhithe's gaze flicked toward the window, where the outline of the carriage house was faintly visible beyond the lawn. Holmes followed that glance. Rotherhithe recovered. I shall not permit intrusion without proper authority. Holmes inclined his head. As is your right. He turned toward the door. You leave? Rotherhithe demanded. For the present. Outside, the cold struck sharply. Eddie Holmes paused near the gate, his expression thoughtful rather than defeated. He will destroy evidence, I said. On the contrary, Holmes replied quietly. He dare not. Destruction invites suspicion. But without the carriage, Holmes's thin smile returned. Lestrade approaches even now. From the darkness beyond the drive came the crunch of boots upon gravel. Inspector Lestrade emerged, accompanied by 2 constables. You sent word, he said tersely. Holmes nodded. Mr. Rotherhithe declines voluntary cooperation. I suggest you obtain immediate authority to examine his carriage. Lestrade's eyes gleamed. I have it. Within minutes, the carriage house doors were thrown open. Lantern lights spilled across polished metal and lacquered wood. Holmes bent low beside the step plate, measuring its ridges with a small brass caliper he carried. He straightened slowly. A perfect correspondence, he said. Behind us, Rotherhithe stood rigid in the lamplight, his face drained of colour. Holmes regarded him steadily. You visited Mary Hargreaves that night. Whether you intended only intimidation or something darker, events exceeded your design. Edward Carrow proved a convenient scapegoat, but he possessed a conscience and perhaps a final courage. Rotherhithe's lips parted, yet no denial came. The night seemed to hold its breath as Lestrade stepped forward. Edmund Rotherhithe, he said, I must ask you to accompany us. For a single, suspended instant, I believed Edmund Rotherhithe would submit with the cold dignity he had thus far affected. Instead, something brittle snapped within him. His gaze darted past Lestrade to the shadowed sweep of the lawn. Before either constable could anticipate the movement, he wrenched free and bolted toward the side of the carriage house. After him! Cried Lestrade. Holmes did not shout. He sprang forward with astonishing swiftness, cutting across the gravel at an angle that revealed his foresight. Rotherhithe had aimed for a narrow postern gate leading toward the river path beyond the estate. The frost-slick stones betrayed him, his boot skidded, and in that instant Holmes seized his coat collar with an iron grip. The struggle was brief, but fierce. Rotherhithe struck backward blindly, his ringed hand glancing off Holmes's shoulder. The garnet flashed once more in the lantern light before Holmes twisted his wrist with a practised motion. The ring struck the stone threshold of the gate with a sharp crack. I heard, even above the scuffle, the brittle snap of stressed metal. Lestrade and the constables closed in. Rotherhithe sagged, breath ragged, fury and something perilously close to despair contorting his features. It is finished, Holmes said quietly, releasing his hold only when the irons were secured. Rotherhithe's eyes blazed. You understand nothing. On the contrary, Holmes replied, stooping briefly to retrieve a fragment from the ground. He held it up between finger and thumb. The garnet, now fully dislodged, lay dull and fractured in his palm. I understand that stones, like lies, fracture under pressure. Rotherhithe made no reply as he was led toward the waiting carriage. Yet even in defeat, a peculiar resolve hardened his expression, as though he clung to some final certainty beyond our grasp. When at last the wheels bore him away under escort, Holmes remained standing by the gate, studying the broken ring. You expected flight, I said. I expected desperation, he corrected. Guilt that has sustained composure too long often seeks escape at the first tangible blow. Lestrade returned from issuing instructions to his men. He'll be lodged securely. The carriage marks are sufficient to hold him. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the dark silhouette of the house. Sufficient to charge him with presence, he said. "Not yet with murder." Lestrade frowned. "What more do you require?" "A sequence beyond doubt," Holmes replied. "We have motive in the securities, opportunity in his visit, and attempted evasion. Yet I would know precisely how Mary Hargreaves met her end." "The strangulation was clear," Lestrade said. "Manual pressure alone?" Holmes asked. "A cord was suspected, though none was found." Holmes turned the broken ring fragment in his palm. "Caro's letter mentioned a candle that burned without smoke. We have established its use. But why bring such a candle unless time was required, time in which ordinary tallow smoke might betray presence?" Lestrade considered. "You suggest he lingered?" "I suggest he searched." "For the securities?" "Precisely." We returned to the carriage house. Holmes knelt beside the step plate once more, lantern light throwing stark angles across his features. "Observe here," he said, pointing to a faint, dark stain along the inner edge of the carriage floor. "Not mud." I bent closer. It bore a dull, brownish hue. "Blood?" I ventured. Holmes touched it lightly with a handkerchief. "Old, imperfectly cleaned." Lestrade's jaw tightened. "Are you from that night?" "Possibly transferred upon a boot." He rose. "We must revisit the parlour again." Lestrade groaned softly, but did not protest. By the time we reached Ratcliffe Highway once more, the hour was late and the street deserted. Inside the silent parlour, Holmes moved directly to the hearth. He knelt where the body had lain and examined the rug's weave. "Here," he murmured. Embedded within the fibres lay a faint, almost invisible indentation, circular, no larger than a coin. "The base of the candlestick," Lestrade said. "No," Holmes replied. "Too small." He withdrew from his pocket the broken garnet and held it above the mark. It fit the circle with uncanny precision. Watson felt a chill unrelated to the cold room. "He pressed her down," Holmes said softly. The ring against her throat. The garnet setting bruised the skin in that very shape. When she struggled, the stone struck the hearth edge and chipped. Lestrade inhaled sharply. "Then the mark upon her neck would have borne the imprint of a circular ridge," Holmes finished. "Did the medical report note such?" Lestrade's brow furrowed. "There was mention of an unusual contusion. We attributed it to the struggle." Holmes rose slowly. Rotherhithe confronted her. She resisted. In the struggle he used his hand, his ringed hand, to silence her. The garnet fractured against the hearth. Caro, hearing movement, fled. Rotherhithe, realizing he could not escape unnoticed, contrived the bribery. "And the letter?" I asked. Holmes's gaze darkened. Caro repented. Whether he confided in Merton or dictated under pressure, the letter's existence unsettled Rotherhithe. That is why he feigned ignorance so poorly. Lestrade nodded grimly. "With the medical detail and the ring fragment, we have him." Holmes replaced the garnet fragment into its paper wrapping. "We have the mechanism," he said quietly. "Now we must secure the confession." As we extinguished the lantern and stepped back into the chill London night, I could not help but reflect upon the cruel irony. A thief had swung from the gallows for a crime born of another man's greed and panic. Yet Holmes's expression, though resolute, was not triumphant. "There remains," he said softly, "one man whose conscience we have not yet fully measured." Holmes's reference required no clarification. By the time we returned to Baker Street in the small hours, his course was fixed. "Rotherhithe will deny until the last," he said, removing his gloves with deliberate care. "But a denial built upon pride is less durable than one founded upon belief. The reverend gentleman interests me more." You think Merton complicit in the murder? I asked. In the murder? Uncertain in its concealment? Highly probable. Holmes seated himself and spread before him the two documents, the official prison statement and the so-called last confession delivered to Lestrade. He studied them anew beneath the steady glow of our lamp. "Observe again," he said, beckoning me closer. In the prison statement, the pressure of the pencil deepens at emotional emphasis, particularly upon words of repentance. In the letter, that pressure is absent. The strokes are careful, imitative. You believe Merton wrote it? I believe Caro may have dictated it in the chaplain's presence. The wax, both the candle, the timing, all point to access within the condemned cell. Then why deliver it at all? Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. Because conscience is an unstable ally. Suppose Caro confessed privately to Merton that he had taken money to lie. Suppose he demanded that truth be preserved. Merton, torn between spiritual duty and loyalty to a benefactor such as Rotherhithe, might promise to hold the letter until after the execution. And then deliver it, too late to save Caro, yet sufficient to ease his own conscience. The following morning we presented ourselves once more at St. Bartholomew's. Reverend Merton received us in his study, though the composure he displayed earlier had diminished. News of Rotherhithe's arrest had clearly travelled swiftly. "You return again, Mr. Holmes," he said, his tone restrained. Holmes placed the two letters upon the desk between them. "Inspector Lestrade has Rotherhithe in custody. The physical evidence is persuasive. Yet there remains the matter of this confession." Merton's gaze flickered downward. "You were present in Caro's final hours," Holmes continued. "Did he speak to you of bribery?" Merton's hands tightened upon the edge of the desk. He expressed remorse. For murder? For sin? Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Reverend, a man's soul may be eased by absolution, but justice demands clarity. Did Caro confess to killing Mary Hargreaves in your hearing?" A silence stretched between them. "At first," Merton said slowly, "he maintained his guilt, but later, when the cell grew quiet, he spoke differently." Holmes did not interrupt. "He said he had taken money," Merton continued, his voice lowering. "That he had been promised assistance for his sister. He claimed another man had strangled the woman. I rebuked him for shifting blame." "Did you believe him?" Merton hesitated. "I did not know what to believe." Holmes gestured to the second letter. "He dictated this to you." The clergyman's face drained of colour. "You sealed it with your wax," Holmes pressed. "You delivered it to Lestrade's rooms before the execution." "I intended to post it after," Merton said hoarsely. "But when I learned that Caro had indeed taken money from Mr. Rotherhithe, charity, he called it, I feared scandal. I thought the matter better concluded." "Concluded?" Holmes's voice hardened. "By allowing an innocent man to hang?" Merton flinched. "He was no innocent. He was a thief." "He was not a murderer." The Reverend's composure crumbled.
I am a servant of God, not of the courts. Rotherhithe assured me the woman's death was accidental, a struggle gone awry. He begged me to prevent further disgrace. He promised to provide for the sister." Holmes regarded him with cold intensity. "And you believed wealth over a condemned man's final plea?" "I believed repentance possible," Merton whispered. Holmes gathered the letters. "Your duty was to truth." Merton sank into his chair, the weight of that simple assertion pressing heavily upon him. Lestrade arrived shortly thereafter. Confronted with Merton's admission, his expression grew grim. "You'll be required to make a full statement," he said. Merton nodded faintly. I shall. By afternoon, we were present at Scotland Yard, where Rotherhithe sat rigid in an interview room, his pride now tempered by the accumulating evidence.
When confronted with the ring fragment, the carriage marks, the medical reports, circular contusion, and finally Merton's testimony regarding the bribery, his resistance faltered. "It was not meant to end so," he said at last, voice strained. "She threatened exposure. I only meant to frighten her." "And so you pressed your hand upon her throat," Holmes said quietly. She struggled. The ring struck the hearth. I felt it crack. When she ceased moving, I panicked. "You then purchased silence." Rotherhithe closed his eyes briefly. Caro was already known. It seemed expedient. The confession, once begun, flowed with bitter inevitability. By evening it was committed to paper, signed beneath the fractured garnet ring, now removed from his hand. As we left the yard under a dimming sky, Lestrade exhaled heavily. "It is done," he said. Kit Holmes's expression was grave. "Justice, perhaps, but not redemption." I walked beside him in thoughtful silence. The machinery of law had at last corrected its course, yet too late for Edward Caro, and though Rotherhithe's guilt was laid bare, and Merton's complicity exposed, the echo of the gallows remained. Holmes paused at the curb before hailing a cab. "There is one final duty," he said softly. "We must go to Limehouse." The cab bore us once more through the dim arteries of the East End, where the evening fog clung low and the lamps cast their jaundiced halos upon wet cobbles. Holmes spoke little during the journey. His profile, etched against the blurred window, wore an expression not of triumph, but of sober reflection. Annie Caro's lodging appeared unchanged since our last visit, though the air about it seemed heavier. She opened the door herself, her eyes widening at the sight of us. "It is finished," Holmes said gently. She searched his face. "My brother?" "He did not kill Mary Hargreaves." For a moment she swayed, gripping the doorframe as though the words themselves possessed weight. "Then—" "The man responsible has confessed," Holmes continued. "Your brother was bribed to take the blame." Tears rose unbidden to her eyes, yet there was no hysteria in her manner, only a quiet, profound grief. "They hanged him," she whispered. Holmes inclined his head. "They did." She stepped aside, and we entered the small room where a single lamp burned low. The modest furnishings bore the marks of careful maintenance despite hardship. Upon a shelf lay a folded newspaper recounting the execution. "He told me he was sorry," she said softly. "Oh, I thought he meant for his crimes." "He meant for his choice," Holmes replied. Watson felt a tightening in his throat. Holmes's voice, though composed, carried an undercurrent of rare gentleness. "Mr. Rotherhithe will stand trial," Holmes continued. "Reverend Merton has admitted withholding the truth." Annie's gaze hardened faintly. "The gentleman with the ring?" "Yes." She turned toward the small window, staring into the fog beyond. "Ned said the man's hands were soft. He said it was strange to see such hands tremble." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Tremble?" She nodded. "After the trial. He told me the gentleman's hand shook when he gave him the money." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Fear," he murmured. "Not charity." Annie drew a breath. "Will that bring my brother back?" "No," Holmes said quietly. Silence settled between us, heavy yet strangely calm. At length Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope. "Rotherhithe promised provision for you," he said. "That promise shall be fulfilled by court order." She accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. "Thank you." Holmes inclined his head but did not linger. As we stepped once more into the narrow street, the distant toll of a ship's bell drifted from the river. "He was not innocent," I said after a time. "No," Holmes agreed. "He was not. But he was not guilty of murder." Holmes walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "The law requires precision, Watson. When it errs, even by haste, the cost is irretrievable. You hold yourself responsible." He stopped beneath a lamp-post, its light casting sharp angles upon his face. "I was not consulted before the trial. Had I been, perhaps the garnet fragment would have been discovered sooner." "You cannot solve every crime before judgment falls." Holmes's lips thinned. "No, but I can endeavour to solve those placed before me." We resumed our walk toward the main thoroughfare, where a cab might be found. The fog thickened, swallowing the outlines of buildings into shifting grey. "Reverend Merton will face censure," I observed. "Justly," Holmes replied. "Yet I suspect his punishment will be of a subtler kind. Conscience is an unrelenting jailer." "And Rotherhithe, he shall meet the machinery he so readily manipulated." Holmes's tone bore no vindictiveness, only measured certainty. At length we reached a broader street where traffic stirred faintly despite the hour. Holmes paused once more. "There remains the matter of the public record," he said thoughtfully. "Caro's name must not stand forever beneath that false stain. Can it be amended?" "A posthumous correction," Holmes replied. "It will not restore life, but it may restore truth." The cab arrived, and we mounted in silence. As the wheels carried us westward, I found myself contemplating the strange chain of events: a ring's fractured stone, a smokeless candle, a letter delivered too late. Each element, insignificant in isolation, had converged to expose a deception both calculated and cowardly. Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. "Remember this, Watson," he said softly. "A man may construct the most elaborate edifice of falsehood, yet a single overlooked detail, the absence of soot, the chip of a stone, will betray him. And if that detail emerges too late," Holmes opened his eyes, "then we pursue it still. For truth, though delayed, has a way of surfacing like a body long submerged." His words lingered in the dim carriage as we approached the familiar lamps of Baker Street. Though the case had reached its legal conclusion, its moral weight remained, and I could not help but sense that Holmes himself, for all his outward detachment, carried that weight more keenly than he would ever admit. In the weeks that followed, London's attention shifted with characteristic swiftness from one sensation to the next. Yet the case of Edmund Rotherhithe did not fade so easily. The evidence, once assembled in orderly sequence, proved devastating. The carriage step plate's ridges were shown to correspond precisely with the scratches upon Mary Hargreaves's threshold. That the garnet fragment recovered from her parlour matched the stone dislodged from Rotherhithe's ring during his attempted flight. The medical testimony, revisited with greater care, confirmed the presence of a circular contusion upon the victim's throat consistent with the ring's setting. Finally, Reverend Merton's reluctant but unequivocal statement regarding the bribery of Edward Caro extinguished any lingering doubt. Holmes attended the trial only briefly. He had little patience for rhetoric once the logic stood complete. I, however, was present when Rotherhithe at last rose in the dock, his former composure eroded by the steady accumulation of facts. He did not attempt to deny the confrontation with Mrs. Hargreaves. Instead, he spoke of panic, of a struggle unintended to end in death. Now, yet beneath his words lay the undeniable truth. He had chosen concealment over confession, and in so doing consigned another man to the rope. The verdict was swift. As Rotherhithe was led away, I noted that his right hand, now stripped of its garnet ring, trembled visibly. Reverend Merton did not stand trial, yet ecclesiastical censure followed, and his resignation from St. Bartholomew's was accepted without protest. It was said that he retired to a small parish in the north, where his days would pass in quieter service. Whether that quiet brought him peace, I cannot say. One grey afternoon, some fortnight after the proceedings concluded, I found Holmes seated by the fire at Baker Street, the broken garnet fragment resting upon the mantel before him. He had kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. His violin lay idle across his knees. The Home Office has amended the record, he said, without looking up. Edward Carrow's conviction for murder is to be formally set aside. A small mercy, I replied. Holmes inclined his head. Small, but necessary. He rose and placed the garnet fragment into a small wooden box among other curious relics of past cases, tokens of crimes unravelled and truths restored. Yet I observed that he did so with a deliberation that bordered upon reverence. You are troubled, I ventured. Holmes turned toward the window, where a thin rain traced wavering lines upon the glass. I am reflective. Of what? Of timing, he said quietly. Had the letter reached Lestrade a day earlier, had the chip of stone been noticed before the trial? You cannot rewrite the past. No, he agreed. How but one may refine the future. He resumed his seat and took up his violin at last. A low, contemplative melody filled the room, neither mournful nor triumphant, but measured, as though balancing scales unseen. Later that evening, Lestrade called briefly to confirm that Annie Carrow had received financial restitution drawn from Rotherhithe's estate. It won't mend much, he admitted gruffly, but it's something. Holmes accepted the news with a quiet nod. When the inspector had gone, he turned once more to the fire. Lestrade performs his duty with admirable tenacity, he remarked, yet even the machinery of justice requires vigilant maintenance. And you are its mechanic? I said with a faint smile. Holmes's lips twitched. Hardly. At best I am a diagnostician. The rain intensified, drumming softly upon the panes. Outside, the lamps along Baker Street glowed in steady defiance of the gloom. I found myself contemplating the curious interplay of chance and design that had governed the affair. A smokeless candle chosen for discretion, a garnet ring worn in vanity, a confession delivered too late. Each detail, insignificant in isolation, had converged to reveal the truth. Holmes lowered his violin and regarded me with that penetrating gaze which so often preceded some philosophical observation. Consider, Watson, he said, how narrow is the margin between guilt and innocence when measured by imperfect knowledge. A single overlooked detail may condemn, a single observed detail may redeem. And yet redemption did not come in time for Carrow. Holmes's expression softened, though only slightly. No, but it came. He rose and moved toward his writing desk. With swift strokes, he penned a brief note, sealed it, not with black wax, but with plain red, and addressed it to Annie Carrow. I did not inquire as to its contents. As he extinguished the lamp, Holmes paused a moment in the half-light. The world is not governed by sentiment, Watson, he said quietly. It is governed by consequence. Our task is merely to ensure that consequence aligns as closely as possible with truth. With that he retired to his chamber, leaving me alone beside the fading fire. I reflected then upon the peculiar blend of detachment and moral clarity that defined my friend. To the casual observer he might appear cold, even arrogant, Yet beneath that exterior lay an unwavering commitment to precision, not merely of thought, but of justice. Had thus concluded the matter of the last confession of the hanged man, a case in which a fragment of stone and the absence of smoke proved stronger than wealth, influence, or deceit. And though the gallows had claimed its victim before truth prevailed, the truth itself, once uncovered, stood immovable. For in the end, as Holmes himself would doubtless insist, it is not the noise of accusation nor the clamour of public opinion that determines reality, but the quiet persistence of fact. It was some months after the trial of Edmund Rotherhithe that the last quiet thread of the affair drew itself to a close. London had long since consumed fresher scandals, yet for Holmes the case was not fully settled until every inference had been tested and every moral equation balanced. One crisp morning, as sunlight at last broke cleanly through a sky washed of fog, Inspector Lestrade called once more at Baker Street. He bore no urgent summons, only a sealed document and an expression curiously subdued. "The execution took place at dawn," he said simply. Holmes inclined his head. There was no triumph in his manner. "And Reverend Merton?" "Gone north, as you surmised. A smaller parish, no public disgrace beyond resignation. He made a full deposition before leaving." Lestrade handed over the document. "The Home Office has entered the formal exoneration of Edward Carow. It will stand in the record." Holmes broke the seal and scanned the contents. When he finished, he passed the paper to me. The language was bureaucratic and spare, yet its meaning was profound. The conviction for the murder of Mary Hargreaves was overturned in light of subsequent evidence. Responsibility was assigned solely to Edmund Rotherhithe. "A necessary correction," Holmes said quietly. Lestrade shifted his weight. "You were right about the candle, you know. We located the supplier. Rotherhithe purchased several of that stearin blend in the weeks prior to the murder." Holmes's eyes flickered with faint interest. "For discretion, not illumination." "Exactly. He admitted he meant to search her desk without leaving trace of smoke." "And instead left a trace of stone." Lestrade allowed himself the ghost of a smile and of pride. When the inspector had departed, Holmes stood for some time at the window, watching the movement of traffic below. The city resumed its ceaseless rhythm. "I indifferent to individual tragedies." "You are dissatisfied," I ventured. "Not dissatisfied," he replied, "merely contemplative." He returned to his chair and took up the small wooden box that contained the garnet fragment. He turned it once in his fingers before setting it back. "Consider the chain," he said. "A woman threatens exposure of financial misconduct. A man of position seeks to silence her. He selects a candle that burns without smoke, believing that absence itself will conceal him. He wears a ring that proclaims his taste, unaware it will proclaim his guilt. He bribes a thief, trusting desperation over conscience, and finally he confides in a clergyman, trusting discretion over duty." "And each element failed him," I observed. "Each element betrayed him," Holmes corrected, "not by design, but by inevitability." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Rotherhithe miscalculated one factor above all others. Which was? The persistence of detail. I smiled faintly. "Your specialty?" Holmes dismissed the notion with a slight wave. "Detail exists whether I observe it or not. The mantel bore no soot. The threshold bore scratches. The hearth bore the chip of garnet. Truth does not shout, it accumulates." There was a pause, broken only by the distant rumble of carriage wheels. "And Carow?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew more thoughtful. Carow made a flawed but comprehensible choice. He valued immediate provision for his sister over abstract justice, yet at the last he sought to restore balance. Through the confession? Yes, though delivered too late to save him, it altered the final reckoning. Holmes rose and crossed to his writing desk. From a drawer, he withdrew a folded letter. "Annie Carrow wrote yesterday," he said, handing it to me. The brief note expressed gratitude, not for vengeance, nor even for restitution, but for the clearing of her brother's name. She spoke of leaving Limehouse to begin anew elsewhere, carrying with her the knowledge that whatever his sins, murder was not among them. Holmes reclaimed the letter and replaced it carefully. "In the end," he said softly, "that knowledge may weigh less heavily upon her than coin." He resumed his seat and regarded the fire, though it was scarcely needed on so mild a day. "Tell me, Watson," he said after a time, "what do you consider the central lesson of this case?" I reflected. "That appearances deceive, that wealth and respectability do not preclude brutality." Holmes inclined his head. "True, but incomplete." He met my gaze with sudden intensity. "The true lesson is this. Justice without scrutiny is merely procedure. Carrow's execution was lawful. It was supported by confession and circumstantial evidence. Yet it was wrong." "You would have the law consult you in every matter?" I said lightly. "I would have the law consult reason," he replied. The faintest smile touched his lips, though it did not fully dispel the gravity in his eyes. "The world," he continued, "is inclined toward expediency. It prefers swift conclusions, clean narratives. A thief with a record is easily cast as a murderer. A gentleman with a crest is easily believed innocent. My task, our task, is to resist such inclinations." He rose and moved once more to the window. Outside, a newspaper boy shouted headlines unrelated to any of this. Life pressed forward. "Rotherhithe believed himself insulated by status," Holmes said quietly. "Merton believed himself shielded by intention. Carrow believed himself trapped by circumstance. In the end, none escaped consequence." "And you?" I asked. Holmes turned, a flicker of irony in his expression. "I escape only boredom." He took up his violin and drew the bow across the strings. This time the melody was lighter, almost brisk, as though acknowledging not victory, but closure. Thus ended the affair of the last confession of the hanged man. A smokeless candle had sought to erase presence. A garnet ring had sought to display refinement. Both became instruments of revelation. And though one life had been unjustly extinguished before truth prevailed, that truth, once uncovered, stood unassailable. For Sherlock Holmes, and it was another demonstration of an immutable principle, that facts, however small, form the bedrock upon which justice must stand. And where facts are obscured by wealth, by fear, or by misplaced loyalty, it is the patient, relentless examination of detail that restores their light.